It happened on a rainy evening in a small roadside diner where dreams went to die and stories came to life. The waitress, young, tired, and still managing a smile, served coffee to strangers who barely looked her in the eye. She had worked there for years, saving every penny to take care of her little brother, hoping that one day life would show her the same kindness she gave to others. But that night, fate decided to test her heart in front of everyone. Because sitting in the corner booth was a man who had everything money could buy, except decency. He was a billionaire who had stopped his car for a quick meal, the kind of man who wore arrogance like a crown. He looked around the diner with disgust, as if the air itself were unworthy of him. When the waitress accidentally spilled a drop of coffee on his sleeve, he humiliated her in front of the whole place. His words cut sharper than glass, calling her a nobody, a failure, someone who would never matter. The room went silent. Even the old jukebox seemed to choke on the tension. She stood there trembling, clutching the tray, trying to hold back tears that threatened to fall. But destiny never stays quiet for long. Not in that kind of place, and not with those kinds of people. A moment later, the diner door creaked open, and the sound of heavy boots filled the air. 5 men walked in, leather jackets, worn jeans, and the unmistakable emblem of the Hells Angels glinting under the neon lights. The air shifted. Everyone knew their reputation: fierce, loyal, and fearless. Yet what few understood was that they had a code, one built not on wealth, but on respect. The billionaire's smirk faded as the bikers glanced around and noticed the waitress, her eyes red and her hands shaking. The leader, a man with a weathered face and calm steel in his voice, asked her what had happened. She didn't answer, but the silence said enough. The billionaire tried to laugh it off, muttering about people who don't belong in his world. That was the wrong thing to say, because, in that moment, the tables were about to turn in a way no amount of money could prevent. And as the thunder rolled outside, the Hells Angels stepped forward, not to start a fight, but to deliver a lesson. One that no luxury car, no mansion, and no fortune could ever buy. That respect costs nothing, but losing it can make even the richest man poorer than dust. The diner's lights flickered as the storm outside grew louder, lightning flashing through the wide glass windows. The billionaire sat back in his booth, annoyed, pretending not to notice the group of bikers who had just entered. But the Hells Angels weren't there to eat. They were there because the universe sometimes places the right souls in the wrong places at the perfect time. The leader, known only as Mac, took off his gloves slowly, eyes fixed on the trembling waitress who still stood frozen beside the table. He didn't need her to explain. Her face already told a story he'd seen 100 times before: humiliation at the hands of power. Mac turned his gaze toward the billionaire, who didn't bother hiding his arrogance. "You treat people like that often?" he asked calmly, his tone neither angry nor soft, just heavy enough to make the air thick. The billionaire chuckled, his voice dripping with mockery. "I don't take advice from men who play dress-up on motorcycles," he said, crossing his arms. The words hung in the air like poison, and for a moment, the whole diner held its breath. The waitress looked between them, terrified that something terrible was about to happen. But Mac didn't raise his voice or his fists. He simply leaned forward, resting his gloved hands on the counter. "Funny thing," he said, "men like you think money makes you untouchable. But the only thing it really buys is the right to reveal who you are when no one's watching." His words weren't violent. They were honest, and they cut deeper than any punch could. One of the other bikers, a younger man named Ray, took off his jacket and placed it gently over the waitress's shoulders. The gesture silenced the room. Even the cook peered out from the kitchen window, his spatula frozen midair. The billionaire shifted uncomfortably, realizing the situation had changed. He wasn't in a boardroom anymore. His titles, wealth, and pride meant nothing here. This was a place where respect was the only currency that mattered. The waitress whispered that it was fine, that she didn't want trouble, but Max shook his head. "There's no trouble here," he said. "Just a man learning what kindness looks like when he's never had to show it." And in that small diner, under the hum of flickering lights and the smell of burnt coffee, something began to shift. The billionaire's eyes darted between them, uncertain. No one was threatening him. No one was shouting. Yet he felt smaller than he had ever felt before. For the first time, surrounded by men who lived by a code he could never understand, He began to realize that power wasn't about control, it was about dignity. And he had just lost his. Minutes passed in silence. The rain outside softened, but the tension inside remained. The waitress tried to step away, but Ray gently stopped her, nodding for her to stay. Mac turned toward the billionaire and said, "Tell me, when was the last time you said thank you to someone who didn't owe you anything?" The billionaire frowned, confused. "I don't owe anyone gratitude for doing their job," he snapped. The words revealed everything, not just his attitude, but his emptiness. Because a man who believes gratitude is optional has already forgotten what it means to be human. Max sighed and leaned back, crossing his arms. "You ever ride a motorcycle?" he asked suddenly. The billionaire scoffed. "Why would I? I can afford a driver." Max smiled, a slow, knowing smile that carried both pity and understanding. "That's what I thought," he said. "See, when you're on a bike, there's no leather seat, no tinted glass, no air conditioning. Just wind, grit, and truth. You can't fake respect out there. You earn it 1 mile at a time." His words hit like quiet thunder, not because they were loud, but because they were true. The billionaire rolled his eyes, trying to appear unaffected, but the waitress noticed his hand trembling slightly. The mask was cracking. He wasn't used to being challenged by men who didn't want his money, who didn't fear his name. Mac looked at him again. "You see that girl?" he asked, nodding toward the waitress. "She's worth more than your entire bank account, because she still knows how to serve with heart. And that's something you can't buy, no matter how many zeros you've got." For the first time, the billionaire didn't have a reply. His arrogance faltered, replaced by a discomfort he couldn't explain. The room stayed silent as Max spoke again, this time softer. "You ever think maybe life put you here for a reason? Maybe to remind you that pride can blind even the smartest man." The billionaire looked down, his reflection staring back at him from the polished surface of the table, a stranger he no longer recognized. Outside, the thunder faded, and the first rays of dawn began to peek through the clouds. The waitress, still standing there, felt something shift inside her, a strange mixture of relief and awe, because that night, for the first time, someone had stood up for her, not out of pity, but out of principle. And as she watched the biker leader walk away from the counter, she realized that not all heroes wear suits or speak softly. Some ride in with the storm, just to remind the world what justice still looks like. The billionaire sat in silence, staring at the steaming cup of coffee that had been set in front of him earlier, untouched, now cold. For the first time in years, his own voice failed him. He had silenced employees, investors, and even family members with the weight of his name. But here, in this forgotten diner, surrounded by people he would never have noticed before, he was the one being exposed. The waitress, unsure what to do, wiped her hands on her apron and whispered, "It's okay, sir." Really, her kindness was disarming. It wasn't forced or strategic. It was real, and that reality hurt him more than the humiliation ever could. Mac glanced at her, then at the billionaire. "That's the difference," he said quietly. "She gets hurt, but she still forgives. You get questioned, and you attack." The billionaire clenched his jaw, but didn't respond. The truth had a way of burning its way in, slow and steady. One of the other bikers, Dean, spoke up for the first time. "You know, when we were kids, my old man worked double shifts just to buy us food. But he always said something I never forgot, that the measure of a man isn't what he earns, it's how he treats the ones who serve him." His voice was rough, but his message was pure. The billionaire felt his throat tighten, though he couldn't admit why. He'd built his empire on efficiency, on cutting corners, on firing people without looking them in the eye. Success had been his armor, and arrogance his shield. But here, both were useless. He looked at the waitress again, the same girl he'd called a nobody, only minutes earlier. There was a quiet strength in her gaze now, a kind of courage that no money could replicate. And for the first time, he wondered if maybe he had spent his whole life chasing the wrong kind of wealth. Mac walked closer, placing a few bills on the counter. "Pay for his meal," he said to the waitress, who looked at him confused. "He doesn't deserve it," she murmured. Mac smiled faintly. "That's exactly why it matters." The billionaire looked up, surprised. "You're paying for me?" Mac nodded. "Not for you. For what you might become after tonight." The words hung heavy, echoing in the billionaire's chest long after they were spoken. The waitress hesitated, then nodded, slipping the money into the register. The small ding of the drawer closing felt symbolic, like a chapter ending. The billionaire's hands shook as he reached for his coffee, finally taking a sip. It was bitter, too bitter, but somehow it tasted honest. The silence that followed wasn't cold anymore. It was cleansing, almost sacred. Something inside him had begun to break, and, in that breaking, something new was trying to be born. As the Hells Angels prepared to leave, the sound of their boots echoed through the small diner like a steady drumbeat. The billionaire finally spoke, his voice quieter now, stripped of arrogance. Why did you step in?" he asked. Mac paused at the door, glancing back. "Because I've seen too many people lose themselves to power. You reminded me of who I used to be before I learned what really matters." The billionaire frowned, puzzled. "You?" Mac nodded slowly. "Yeah, I wasn't born wearing this patch. I earned it, after losing everything first." The billionaire leaned forward, curious despite himself. "What did you lose?" Mac's eyes softened, memories flickering behind them like old film reels. "My family, my pride, my soul for a while. I used to think I was better than everyone else. Then one day, the world proved me wrong. I ended up broke, alone, and hungry, until a waitress just like her gave me a meal I couldn't afford. She didn't know me, didn't ask questions. She just cared. That's the day I stopped being rich in the wrong things." His words cut through the billionaire like a blade dipped in truth. No one spoke. The waitress's eyes glistened as she realized the full weight of what had just been revealed. Mac wasn't there to humiliate anyone. He was there to repay a debt written not in money, but in grace. "You think being rich is about what's in your wallet," Mac continued, "but real wealth is what's left when everything else is gone." The billionaire swallowed hard, unable to meet his gaze. For the first time, he felt small, not because someone made him feel that way, but because he finally saw himself clearly. Ray opened the diner door, letting the morning light spill in. Mac turned to the billionaire one last time. "Maybe tonight was your chance to start over. Don't waste it." Then he nodded to the waitress. "Take care of yourself, sweetheart." And just like that, the bikers stepped out into the dawn, their engines roaring to life like thunder rolling away into the horizon. The sound faded, but the silence they left behind was filled with meaning. The billionaire sat there for a long time, staring at the empty doorway. The world outside looked different now, sharper, quieter, realer. He didn't know it yet, but something had shifted deep inside him. The storm had passed, but it had left behind a kind of peace he hadn't felt in years. The kind that only comes when a man faces himself and chooses to change. The billionaire remained seated long after the bikers were gone, his reflection rippling faintly in the dark surface of the coffee. The waitress cleared the counter slowly, still cautious, unsure if the man before her was the same one who had insulted her minutes earlier. But when he finally lifted his gaze, the arrogance that once clouded his eyes was gone. In its place was something raw, remorse, confusion, perhaps even shame. "I'm sorry," he said, barely above a whisper. The words sounded strange coming from him, fragile and uncertain, but sincere. The waitress froze mid-motion, her eyes wide. She had never expected an apology, least of all from someone like him. He reached in his coat pocket, pulled out his wallet, and placed a stack of bills on the counter, more than enough to cover the meal 10 times over. "For you," he said. But the waitress shook her head, gently pushing it back. "You already paid," she said softly, nodding toward the register where Mac's money still rested. The billionaire blinked, startled by her refusal. "Please," he insisted, "take it." But she smiled faintly and replied, "I don't serve for tips like that. I serve because it's what I do." Those words, simple, honest, and pure, pierced deeper than any lecture ever could. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, leaving the windows streaked with silver light. The billionaire stood, adjusting his coat, suddenly feeling smaller than the tiny diner around him. "You must think I'm a monster," he murmured. The waitress shook her head again. "No," she said, "just a man who forgot what it's like to be treated kindly, and to give kindness back." Her tone carried no bitterness, no anger, just truth. And that truth, quiet and unpolished, broke him in ways no failure ever had. He glanced around, the faded menus, the cracked tiles, the smell of bacon and burnt coffee, and realized that for the first time in a long while, he was somewhere real. No meetings, no contracts, no cameras. Just people. Honest, imperfect, and alive. He turned back to her, his voice steadier now. "What's your name?" She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Lena." He nodded, repeating it under his breath like a vow, as if the name itself was a reminder of everything he needed to remember. When he stepped out into the morning air, the world felt different. The puddles reflected a gray sky slowly turning blue, and the cold wind that hit his face felt almost cleansing. He didn't know what he was going to do next, but he knew one thing. He couldn't go back to being who he was. Something about that night, about those men and that waitress, had stripped away the illusion of wealth and left him face to face with the truth he had buried under layers of luxury. The drive back to the city was silent. The billionaire gripped the steering wheel tightly, watching the horizon blur as he replayed every moment from the diner in his mind. The humiliation, the confrontation, the quiet dignity in Lena's eyes. For the first time, he didn't try to justify himself. He didn't push the guilt away or dress it in excuses. He simply let it sit there, heavy and unrelenting, because he finally understood that pain is often the first sign of awakening. When he arrived at his penthouse, the contrast was unbearable. Marble floors, golden light fixtures, and walls of glass that looked over the entire city. A fortress built to keep the world out. Yet now it all felt hollow. He walked past the shelves of imported wine and the untouched piano, his footsteps echoing like reminders of everything he'd gained and everything he'd lost in the process. He stopped in front of a mirror and studied the reflection staring back. For years, he'd seen power. That morning, he saw emptiness. He poured himself a glass of water and sat down, his mind restless. He thought about Mac, a man who had lost everything yet found himself. He thought about Ray's jacket over Lena's shoulders, the quiet act of respect. And then, he thought about the way Lena had refused his money. That was when he realized the truth. All his life, he'd mistaken value for price. And now, for the first time, he wanted to live for something money couldn't buy. The following days were strange. He canceled meetings. He stopped attending events. His staff whispered, unsure what had changed. But deep inside, something was transforming. He began reading letters from employees he had once ignored, handwritten requests for help, ideas that had gone unanswered. He found one from a janitor named Paul, dated months ago, asking for medical assistance for his daughter. He had rejected it without even reading it. The letter trembled in his hands as he realized how many chances for humanity he had thrown away. That night, the billionaire sat by his window, the city lights blinking below like distant stars. For the first time in years, he prayed, not for success or wealth, but for forgiveness. Not from the world, but from himself. He didn't know what redemption looked like, but he knew where it began. In a small diner, with a waitress who showed him that humility could be the richest thing a man could ever own. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the tall glass walls of his apartment, illuminating the untouched luxury that suddenly felt like a museum of mistakes. The billionaire stood in silence, watching the world below. Cars, people, chaos, all moving in rhythm, while he had lived above it all, untouched. But now he wanted to descend from that tower, to walk among the people he had once looked down upon. He showered, dressed simply for once. No tailored suit, no gold cufflinks, and drove back toward the outskirts, where the roads narrowed and the city's noise turned to wind. His destination was clear, though he didn't know what he would say when he arrived. The diner looked smaller in the daylight. The neon sign flickered weakly, and the smell of frying bacon drifted through the open door. Inside, Lena was refilling coffee cups, her hair tied up messily, her smile genuine. She didn't notice him at first. When she finally did, her eyes widened with surprise, then softened into caution. "You came back," she said, her tone a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. He nodded slowly. "I owed you something," he said, "and not the kind of thing that can be paid with money." Lena tilted her head, uncertain. "You don't owe me anything," she replied. But he shook his head. "I owe you respect, and a thank you I should have said the first time." He hesitated, then added, "You taught me something that night. Something I'd forgotten. That people are worth more than their roles." His voice cracked slightly, the weight of honesty pressing through the cracks of his pride. The few customers in the diner turned to listen, sensing something rare, humility from a man who had once embodied arrogance. Lena looked at him quietly for a moment, then nodded. "Maybe it's not about what you say," she murmured. "Maybe it's about what you do now." The words lingered between them, simple yet powerful. He smiled faintly, understanding. He glanced at the "Help Wanted" sign hanging near the counter and pointed to it. "Still looking for help?" he asked. She raised an eyebrow, half amused, half skeptical. "You? You don't seem like the diner type." He chuckled, genuinely this time. "Maybe it's time I learn." The room filled with quiet laughter, but beneath it ran something deeper, the beginning of redemption. He didn't come to be forgiven, and he didn't expect acceptance. He came because he needed to rebuild, one act of humility at a time. And in that moment, as the smell of coffee filled the air and Lena handed him a rag to wipe down the tables, the billionaire, once untouchable, now just a man, took the first step toward becoming human again. Days turned into weeks, and the diner became his refuge. Every morning, he showed up before sunrise, rolled up his sleeves, and did the kind of work he had once considered beneath him. He wiped tables, washed dishes, carried trays, and took orders with a quiet determination that surprised everyone. The regulars whispered, curious about the stranger who looked out of place, yet worked like he belonged. Some recognized him from the papers, the billionaire mogul, but no one dared to ask. The man they saw wasn't the one from headlines. He was someone new, someone grounded. Lena watched him carefully at first, waiting for the facade to crack. But it never did. He didn't complain, didn't boast, didn't seek attention. Instead, he listened. He learned the customers' names, their stories, truckers, teachers, mechanics, mothers. Each one reminded him of a world he had ignored for too long. One evening, after the rush had slowed, he sat at the counter, his hands still damp from washing dishes. "It's strange," he said quietly. "I've made billions, but this feels like the first honest thing I've ever earned." Lena smiled softly. "Money builds walls," she said. "Work builds bridges. Maybe that's what you were missing." He nodded, realizing how true it was. He had built empires, but never connections. And for the first time, connection felt like wealth. The sound of laughter, the warmth of shared coffee, the quiet rhythm of normal life. These were things no amount of money could replace. One afternoon, as he was refilling a customer's cup, a group of bikers rode up. The roar of engines made everyone glance outside. He froze when he saw the emblem, the same one from that night. The Hells Angels. The door swung open, and Max stepped in, a faint grin tugging at his lips when he saw the billionaire wearing an apron. "Didn't think I'd see you again," Max said. The billionaire smiled humbly. "I didn't think I'd be here either," he replied. Mac laughed softly, shaking his head. "Looks like the world still surprises me." He nodded toward Lena. "She must have been your teacher." The billionaire nodded. "Best one I've ever had." Mac's grin widened, but his eyes were serious. "Good. Keep learning. Pride can rebuild itself faster than you think." The words weren't a warning. They were a gift. The billionaire nodded again, silently promising himself he wouldn't forget. As the bikers left, he exhaled deeply, feeling gratitude fill the space that once held only pride. Over time, word began to spread about the mysterious man working at the small roadside diner. Some said he was hiding from something. Others whispered that he had lost everything. But those who came to see for themselves didn't find a man broken by loss. They found one being rebuilt by humility. The billionaire never corrected anyone's assumptions. He didn't need to. The work spoke louder than his past. Each plate he carried, each floor he mopped, each quiet smile he gave became a silent apology. Not just to Lena, but to every person he had ever dismissed on his way to the top. One morning, a black luxury car pulled up outside. His former business partner stepped out, polished and proud, the very reflection of the man the billionaire used to be. He entered the diner, looking around with disdain before his eyes landed on the man behind the counter. "You can't be serious," the partner said with a smirk. "You working here? This is what you become." The billionaire paused, setting down a tray of dishes. He didn't flinch. "No," he said quietly. "This is who I finally am." The partner scoffed, shaking his head. "You had everything. Jets, mansions, power. And you traded it for this." The billionaire looked around. The worn counter, the familiar hum of conversation, Lena's soft laughter as she poured coffee for an old man in the corner, and smiled. "I didn't trade it," he said. "I found what all that money couldn't buy." The partner's smirk faded. "You've lost your mind." The billionaire chuckled softly. "Maybe. But for the first time, I can sleep at night." The room had gone silent. Even the customers listened, though no one dared interrupt. The partner looked around, uncomfortable, then muttered, "You'll regret this. People like us don't belong here." The billionaire shook his head gently. "That's where you're wrong," he said. "People like us should have started here." His tone wasn't bitter. It was calm, certain, like a man who had finally found the answer he'd been chasing all his life. The partner hesitated, eyes flicking toward Lena, then back to him, but found no argument left to make. He left in silence, the sound of the doorbell fading behind him. The billionaire stood still for a moment, then returned to wiping the counter. Lena approached quietly and said, "You didn't have to explain yourself." He smiled faintly. "I wasn't explaining," he said. "I was reminding myself." And in that small moment, surrounded by people who worked hard and lived simply, the man who once owned everything understood something profound. Real peace begins where pride ends. Months later, the diner had become more than a workplace. It was a sanctuary for everyone who walked through its door. The billionaire had turned into its quiet heart, fixing broken chairs, repairing the old coffee machine, and listening to people's stories as if each one carried a lesson he still needed to learn. He no longer lived in the city. He rented a small apartment nearby, modest and peaceful. Gone were the glass walls and golden lights, replaced by creaky floors and the comforting hum of morning rain. Yet for the first time in his life, he felt rich in the ways that mattered. Lena watched the transformation with a quiet pride of her own. She had seen him at his worst, cruel, cold, untouchable, and now she saw him as most human. One evening, as they closed the diner together, she said softly, "You know, you've changed this place." He smiled. "No, this place changed me." She laughed lightly. "Maybe both." Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in gold and crimson. For a moment, neither spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them carried everything words couldn't. Not long after, a letter arrived in the mail, addressed to the diner. It was from Mac. Inside was a photograph. The Hells Angels lined up in front of their bikes, the morning after that storm, and a simple handwritten message: "Respect isn't earned by what you take. It's remembered by what you give." The billionaire stared at it for a long time, then placed it on the wall behind the counter. It stayed there, a quiet reminder of the night everything changed. Weeks later, a young man entered the diner wearing an expensive suit and a tired face, a mirror of who the billionaire once was. He snapped his fingers for service, impatient, irritated. The billionaire approached calmly, setting down a cup of coffee and saying with a gentle smile, "You're in a place where patience pays better than money." The young man frowned, then softened, hearing something in that voice, wisdom earned, not taught. Lena watched from afar, smiling knowingly. History had a way of repeating itself, but this time, it would end differently. And so, the diner remained what it had always been: small, ordinary, and yet somehow sacred. A place where storms brought lessons, where arrogance met grace, and where even the richest man could discover the true meaning of wealth, not in his bank account, but in the quiet dignity of a heart finally at peace. In the end, the diner stood as more than just a roadside stop. It became a symbol of something most people forget in their race for success: that true greatness has nothing to do with wealth, and everything to do with humility. The billionaire's story wasn't about losing money. It was about finding value. He had walked through fire, through his own pride and pain, and came out not richer, but freer. Every plate he served, every thank you he whispered, became a quiet apology to the world he had once ignored. And for those who saw him now, he wasn't the man who fell from power. He was the man who rose into purpose. The waitress, Lena, never treated him differently. She didn't see a billionaire or a broken man. She saw someone learning, growing, and finally listening. In her presence, he discovered something money could never teach: grace. And perhaps that's why he stayed. Not out of guilt, but gratitude. Gratitude for the lesson that life had given him the night he tried to humiliate someone beneath him, and instead met people who stood taller than he ever had. That storm didn't destroy him. It washed away everything false, leaving only what was real. The Hells Angels never returned to that diner, but their legacy did. Every time a stranger was treated with kindness, every time someone offered help without expecting anything in return, their lesson echoed in the walls. That respect is the truest form of power, and compassion is the highest kind of strength. The billionaire often caught himself looking at the photo Mac had sent, wondering if fate had brought them together or if it was simply life correcting its own course. Either way, he had learned what most never do: that redemption begins the moment you stop running from who you are. Years later, people would tell the story of the arrogant man who insulted a waitress and met his awakening in a small diner at the edge of nowhere. Some would call it karma. Others would call it grace. But maybe it was both. The universe's way of reminding us that no one stands so high they can't fall, and no one falls so low they can't rise again. Because in the end, the richest souls aren't those who own the world, but those who finally learn how to serve it. And if this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that respect, kindness, and second chances still matter, then don't let it end here. Share your thoughts below, because every comment is another story waiting to be told. Leave your like if you believe that compassion still changes lives. And subscribe to be part of a place where stories like this one remind us what being human truly means. After all, sometimes the smallest acts, a cup of coffee, a quiet word, a simple apology, are what turn ordinary moments into miracles that last forever.